try to help with graphing the sine and cosine, see if I can help make it make sense, and then you'll get more practice as you go through. So first let's talk about just the pattern. Okay, so what I do is I remember the pattern for the sine and the cosine. So the sine, it's like you're inputting, right? I should even bring up a unit circle here real quick. All right, so when we have a unit circle, if I say, what's the sine of 0? So I'm putting in 0 degrees, I get an output of 0, right? So that's why we see 0, 0 on the graph. If I say, what is the sine of pi over 4? Well, the sine of pi over 4 is square root 2 over 2. That's a decimal. So it's not such an easy point to graph. So I'm going to not choose this point here because it's not a nice point. I want to get the next nice point. And quote, nice points are really at here at 0, at 1, at 0, and at -1, right? Those are the easiest ones to occur, and that's why we see these maxes. At pi over 2, when x is pi over 2, the output of the function y is 1. When the input is 3 pi over 2, the output is -1. So these are our most important points, and we just know there's a pattern, right? We see that there's a 0, a max, a 0, a min, a 0, and the pattern repeats, right? We don't even need this one because this is our one cycle, right? Right, this is one cycle, and the length, so the cycle is actually going like this. The period is how long does it take to do that, oops, and how long does it take to do that is 2 pi. All right, so in the sine function, 0, max, 0, min, 0, you have one cycle. It would do the opposite, right? If you went the opposite way around the unit circle, it would happen, right? If I went to negative input, a negative 3 pi over 2, right? Well, that's going to be -1. And so we could go backwards around it as well. So forwards or backwards. The big idea is to have this. Now, what's the easiest thing to change about this function? The easiest thing would be to change this leading value, the value of a. If I make that, let's say 6, right? These values changed because what am I doing? I'm taking, if I say, what's the sine of 0? Well, the sine of 0 is 0. 0 times 6 is still 0. What's the sine of pi over 2? The sine of pi over 2 is 1. 1 times 6 is 6. So that is going to change the amplitude, right? How high up it goes. So we can say, if we put a minus in there, well, what happened? All that happened was it flipped. Right, it reflected over the x-axis with the negative. All right, so what's the other thing we can do? We can put a little value in front of x here. All right, so let's say that I put 2 in front of that. And what do we see happens? The cycle, right, from the time it goes from a 0 back to a 0, all of a sudden, instead of that taking 2 pi, it only took pi. And that's because the period is always controlled by this value because I'm multiplying. So if I said, what's the sine of pi over 2? Well, I'm not saying pi over 2. I'm multiplying pi over 2 by 2. So all of a sudden I'm saying, what's the sine of pi? And that's 0. So that's why everything is happening faster. So how can I deal with that when I'm graphing it? Well, I can always start by saying, what's the period? The period, right, is always 2 pi divided by the value of b. And b is this value right here. So here I'm saying 2 pi divided by 2. Well, that's going to be just pi, and that's why it's occurring here. So what I do is once I know b, this is all perfectly in fourths. Right? It's going to follow this pattern perfectly in 4. So I take pi, whatever the period is, and I divide it by 4, and I have 1 pi over 4. 2 pi over 4 is the same thing as pi over 2, that's here. Then 3 pi over 4, which is here, and then pi. So whatever the period is, divide it in fourths and make your pattern, and label your x-axis accordingly. Now, one thing that gets tricky is when b actually involves a value of pi. all right, because now these are not issues of pi, so it doesn't make sense to have pi on my x-axis because this is 2 pi divided by 2 pi, so my period is just how long it takes. It's just 1, so I don't need pi on my axis, so get rid of it. Just make it be from -2 to 2, and my step, right, if my period is 1, how am I going to show what's happening here? Well, period is 1, divide that in 4, something is happening every fourth, right? And if I make it be fourths, and I label my x-axis with just values that don't involve pi, it becomes very easy to see. So what are the steps? Find the period, divide that space in fourths. Now, this is really no different for this cosine function. The only difference here is the cosine of x, and we have to change this. Let's go back because b is now 1, so 2 pi divided by 1 is still 2 pi. So now let's keep pi in there, and 2 pi divided into fourths, I'm going to need pi over 4 again. And, well, I really only need pi over 2, but I want to show you, and I want this to go a little bit further out. So I guess to follow my rule, whatever the period is, go ahead and divide it in fourths. So this would be pi over 2. And now this cosine function starts at a max. So its pattern is max, 0, min, 0, max. That's when it's done the whole thing. And again, what's the period? Regular period's just 2 pi, because there's a 1 here, right? 2 pi divided by b is 2 pi. Divide that in fourths. A fourth of 2 pi is pi over 2. Label that, and you'll see your main points. All right, same thing. If I put a value here, it's just going to change the amplitude. If I put a negative, it's going to flip it around, but it's still following that same pattern. If I have some value of b here, let's say it's pi divided by 2, right? So, and this looks weird because I have a pi here. So this would be, I'm trying to do this in my head's a bit tricky, but pi over 2, or 2 pi divided by pi over 2 is going to be, what were these? We just get 1, I think. So, oh, I lost my little, I don't know where my little tool went to change the scale. Anyways, I guess it means it's time to finish the video. So, know the pattern of the sine, know the pattern of the cosine, know the period is pi divided by b, find the period, divide it into fourths, label the x-axis depending, if you don't have pi up here is b, label the x-axis with pi. If you have a pi up here in terms of b, label the x-axis without pi.